Hello, and welcome to the Pluralsight Technology Index webinar. My name is Abe Burnett. I'm a data scientist and the Technology Index lead at Pluralsight. I came to Pluralsight in large part for the opportunity to build the Technology Index. And as far as we've come on the Technology Index, one thing I'll start off by saying is that I think it's still early days and there's lots more work to be done. I still think it has a lot of value to a lot of folks out there. So let's get into it. Let's see what we're going to talk about today. So first of all, we're going to talk about what is the Technology Index. We'll just walk through it in real time, and I'll show you all the different features. And so you have a really good grasp of where everything is at, and where the methodology link is. And there's a write-up, a really excellent write-up that a lot of you will find interesting. I'll show you where that's at. There's an FAQ. So I'll just show you all the different things that you can explore on the Technology Index. Then we'll talk about our reasons for building it. It's two-faceted. We'll get into that. We'll also look at how it differs from other indexes out there in the wild. And then we'll talk about the 10,000-foot perspective on how we built it. And if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty, you will at that point have the knowledge of where the methodology document is so that you can really understand in depth how we calculate the index scores and growth rates and all of that. So we'll also look at some of the known issues and challenges, some of which I've solved and some of which I am currently solving or will be solving in the near future. We're not going to do a Q&A. This is a re-recording of the webinar. So there's only me here. So no one to submit questions for me to answer. But I will still have comments then about how anyone who watches this webinar can contact me with additional questions or submit technologies that they would like me to track on the index. I'm always happy to engage with anyone and everyone on anything related to the Technology Index or anything else really. So, all right, let's get into it. So the demo. So when you plug in pluralsight.com/tech-index, it'll bring you to this main page. So we have Pluralsight Technology Index. You'll see some initial blurb here about how many data points we're tracking and how many technologies. And then you'll see links to different audiences. So when we think of the Technology Index, we think of it from an audience oriented perspective. So at this point, we map every technology to a single audience. And I realize there are some flaws in that, but that's how Pluralsight looks at the world of technology and content that covers that technology. And so there is some overlap, and I don't want to misrepresent how our curriculum is created, because sometimes it does include, it does cover the overlap between, say, software dev and IT ops. So, but at a high level, we think of content as being serving these distinct audiences, like software developers or IT ops or data or security. So, and with that in mind, we have indexes that map the same way. So we have an index for technologies that we have mapped to software development. So this is, the first page here is just the top 5 for each audience. So here's software development, then we have IT ops, and then data professional, and then security professional. So you will also notice that you can go directly to each of these audiences, like the entire index, beyond the top 5. But if we click on, say, View All IT Ops Technologies, it will load the index for IT folks. And so we have a beautiful bubble chart at the top. We have a search for, say, Ubuntu. Select it, okay? So you can see growth trend, you can see its current ranking, and here you can see highlighted its relative, the size indicates its most recent ranking. versus others. So you can see the relative popularity. There's also you know, front and center here, dive deep into our methodology link that takes you to our methodology document. You can tell that the cooler colors here, they indicate declining, technologies that are declining in popularity. The hotter color or warmer color indicates technologies that are rising in popularity. And then let's see here. So this is the link I was thinking about earlier, where it is, if you click on it, it takes you directly to the index, the full index for each of these other audiences. So if we click on software development, it takes us to the entire index for software development, right? So more than, or at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, view all, and then you get more, right? And then you can keep going, I guess, all the way to the end of the list of software development technologies that we are tracking. So when we're looking at an entire audience level index, like for software development, we already talked about the bubble chart up here, but we can also search here, right? So let's do PHP, and we can see there's 2 results that have PHP in the name of the technology, PHP and Cake PHP. We can also clear that field. We can do a filter by type, and keep in mind, type here means anything that can remotely be considered a language, a framework, a data store. So this is a super high level filter. And essentially, how did so these are all basically manually tagged in my, basically I manually tag all of these technologies with a type. So, and how do I get that type? I basically look at how either the vendor or the project, if it's an open source project, or how others on the internet describe a technology. So if it is described as a, well, data store is not a great example, but if it's described as a tool, then, you know, especially if it's by the vendor, the open source project, then that's what I call it here. That's the type I give it. So under tools, you'll see things like Git, Selenium, Vim, Eclipse, Xcode. If we go to languages, you'll see more of what I was talking about, how there are some things that are vaguely languages, but aren't really what we think of, especially when it comes to programming languages like UML, right? So I think it stands for Unified Modeling Language, but it is described, you know, on the internet as, well, and in its own name, right, as a language. So that is how it got the type label of language. So the other thing you've seen me do here is click on this drop down. So this expands basically the JavaScript row. So you can see the current rank. You can see the overall 3-month trend, which kind of averages out for JavaScript to 0. You can see the most popular courses. So this is basically derived from those courses having the most view time over the last 3 months for this technology, in this case JavaScript. So JavaScript getting started, JavaScript fundamentals, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript the big picture were the most popular courses on a view time basis in the past 3 months. So it's a simple metric. I mean, and that's one of the main philosophies of the technology index, is I want our approach to be simple enough that most people can understand it and kind of wrap their head around it. If the methodology is too complex, too magical, too hand-wavy, then it won't be believable in my mind. And then here is a path. So we map to paths that are related. So you might see some cases where, let's see if we can find an example. Yeah, Lua. So we have 1 course, so that's probably, this is an indication if you see less than 3, that's generally an indication that we don't have more than 1 or 2 courses which are tagged as being primarily about, in like say Lua, right? So this can be a signal of our coverage, you know, at a very broad level. And then there's no path, right? If there's no path, then in all likelihood we don't have a path for this technology. So there are all of these expand, so you can kind of explore to a degree our library this way. So you can see Groovy, we have a couple courses, no path, COBOL, one course, ASP.NET, Razor, and Erlang, no courses, but growing rapidly, geez. Huh. Okay, so, but if we go down to the bottom, actually, no, I remember where I found this before. It's on the home page. So if we go to the bottom here, you'll see this Learn More. So you'll also see that this is a FAQ, and this is a methodology. And then we have an excellent article here covering the Pluralsight Technology Index, which I recommend reading. So let's look at the FAQ. So this is some questions that we've received about the index and just provided answers for here. So anyone who's interested can see if we've already answered your question. We also just made up some questions we think people have, and we answered those here too. So something that you can review at your leisure. Then we go back and look at the methodology. So you can see up here, there's kind of some high-level text that describes things and kind of establishes some questions for you, like if you want to know how popular JavaScript is compared to blockchain, Swift to Kotlin. So this is getting at one of the main drivers of value in the index is that it's contextual and not specific to a single domain. But then you'll also see here we have data sources. So we talk about the data sources that we use in the index, guiding principles. So this is like the philosophy of the index. Calculating the index is the nuts and bolts of how the actual index score is calculated. And then kind of thoughts about what the index means from our perspective, and also what it is not from our perspective. So I highly recommend this document. I wrote this up at some point fairly early, and it's been updated as the index has been growing and developing. And then I was very grateful for the help of our branded content team at Pluralsight and our customer success team, which helped me to refine it and make it more concise and intuitive. So let's go back here. So let's see, we've talked about methodology fact, this analyzing the index article. So it calls out some things. There's some trends that we've analyzed in here, some good insights from authors and experts, and I recommend it. All right, so we've talked about the bubble chart. We've talked about how you can see the top 5 on the main page or get to the full index by clicking on that. There's the methodology link. We've talked about the search and the filter by type, the drop downs. All right, so that is the Pluralsight Technology Index as it has been exposed on our website. So let's go back to our presentation. So next we're going to talk about why we built it. What was our motivation? So it's really two-faceted, right? So it's external, there's an external motivation and there's an internal motivation. So when I was interviewing with Pluralsight 3 years ago, the reason they wanted something like the Technology Index is because they needed a quantitative tool to help them plan for content strategy, right? So they want to know about those technologies that they don't have any content for, that are popular, that there's a lot of engagement around, and that they should explore creating content for. So that's what we call blind spot detection, because it can be really hard to identify your blind spots if the only data you have to analyze is based upon, say, X number of courses or pieces of content that cover a specific set of technologies, right? Like, how well your PHP content is doing, but you don't know how well, let's see, what's a good example? Phoenix content, Phoenix the framework, right? If you don't have any Phoenix content, then you don't know how well Phoenix content could potentially perform. So there was a hypothesis at the time that something like the technology index, there would be some relationship between what the popularity on the index would be, say for the Phoenix framework, and how well content would perform for that technology. So we wanted to basically test this idea by building the technology index and seeing if we could spot some blind spots and build content for technologies that we hadn't covered much or at all before, and see if there was a relationship there. And then there's also just a need to understand how much content do we need. At what point do we see, given a certain level of popularity, at what point do we see that each subsequent course or guide or project or path actually has diminishing value to the organization and to the users, to the learners and leaders. Then there's also, honestly, just it's a great way to build our brand as thought leaders and give back to the community. So on the external side, we see the value as the technology index being a map of the larger technology landscape, right? So you understand contextually where things are, right? So you understand how different technologies relate in terms of popularity. And that hasn't been done before until the technology index came along. And then it's also to help leaders and learners, that's how we think of the world, understand kind of their stack, right? So if you're a learner, it helps you know how relevant your skill set is. And it helps you plan for the future because you can see which technologies are coming and where they're at, right? Like, so when, think about React and Angular. Like, if you had been able to see their growth trajectory before they became hot technologies, then as a learner, you could be ahead of the curve, right? So when React is a big deal and employers want React, and that you're tired of the job you have and you want to get a new one, you've already learned the new hot skill, and you can get that new awesome job that wants React skills or Angular skills. So it helps you plan for the future. And leaders, it's essentially very similar, right? Like, you have a certain stack that you deploy in your organization, and it helps you understand how relevant that stack still is and see which technologies are on the horizon so that you can start investigating them, experimenting with them, seeing if they have a role to play in your organization. I do want to talk about my personal story, which was that, was it 10, 12 years ago? Ruby on Rails had come out, was pretty darn new. It had only been out for like a year or two. And I'd heard about it. I'd, reading the various community news and people's thoughts on it. And it seemed like it was doing a lot of things better than like PHP at the time. PHP was huge, and Ruby on Rails seemed to solve a lot of these problems that folks had with PHP, and do it in an intuitive and elegant way. But I was uncertain about, if my read on Ruby on Rails was accurate. Like it seemed like everybody was excited about it, but that was a subjective take. And I didn't have like a quantitative sense for, is Ruby on Rails going places? So consequently, I did not learn Ruby on Rails. Obviously, things have worked out well. I love being a data scientist. But I'm sure there are other people at the time whose future could have benefited from learning Ruby on Rails. So, but the bottom line is that there was no quantitative tool that gave me insights into trends on technology popularity. If there had been, I could have gone to that tool and typed in Ruby on Rails and seen like, oh wow, look at that growth trajectory. This looks like a great candidate for me to invest my time in learning. All right. And so part of the problem is not just it's both you want to compare contextually, say a technology like Ruby on Rails to other technologies that are different, like databases or languages, but you also want to compare it to technologies that are similar, like frameworks. So currently, the technology index is a contextual index. So we don't do very well at showing popularity within a domain. So like at the front end framework level, and that is something we have known about for a long time and are working on solutions for. We do a fairly good job of showing relative popularity among different technologies. Other indexes, like the TOB index, Spectrum, IEEE index, the Stack Overflow Developer Survey, not an index, but similar, right? RedMonk, and which is also not an index, but is similar enough that I'm going to call it one for the purposes of this webinar. And the PYPL index, they all focus on a specific single domain. So most commonly programming languages, and I've seen databases or say Linux distributions. In order to keep it doable or more doable, they limit the number of data sources they utilize. The more data sources you use, that means more API connections, more scrapers, and things just get more brittle and hard to maintain. And then because they're focused on a single domain, it means they're tracking a much more limited set of technologies, right? So like the top 50 programming languages or whatever. Their methodologies, in order to keep things like more doable and easy to maintain, it generally is some variation of, X programming submitted to like a search engine, be it YouTube or Google search or whatever. So it's simplistic methodology, and that methodology can work well sometimes, like in the case of like a technology that has a unique name, like JavaScript. If you type JavaScript into Google search, you will get very relevant results because JavaScript is very unique. If you type in Crystal or Python, you're going to have trouble, right? So Python programming will get you decent results in, say, Google search. But if you type in Crystal programming into Google search, like you get back many results. I think the last time I checked, it was like hundreds of millions of results. And the vast majority of them are not for the Crystal programming language, which is actually a thing. They are for this kind of new age idea of you buy a crystal online and you receive it in the mail and you imbue it with like your life energy. I don't really understand it, but so that sounds like essentially it, and it's very, very different from the Crystal programming language. So on that note, we felt like we needed to do a lot better. We needed to have a different way of being more precise in getting relevant results, and so that our signal wouldn't blow up on technologies that have generic names. So, and there's more of them than I wish there was. There's actually two different flows out there. One is from Facebook, one is from Microsoft. That's recent. And those are very hard to get reasonably directional signal on, because you have to build, and what we do with the technology index is we build handcrafted queries to get as precise a signal as we can on the popularity of a technology from a given data source. I can talk a little bit more about that on my next slide. So these other indexes also typically use just a few data sources, and there can be a risk in that approach of being biased towards specific audiences. But on the other hand, if we're thinking about like programming languages, then if you're using GitHub, Stack Overflow, and Google Search, then you're probably not too worried about bias, right? Because those are going to be pretty decent reads on programming language popularity. On the other hand, if you're doing a contextual index like the technology index is, then you need to use more data sources. If you're trying to compare technologies in different domains to each other. Oh, here we go. So the Pluralsight Technology Index is a contextual index, as I like to think of it. And so that means you can compare different technologies from different domains to one another, right? And you can also, as a byproduct, you can also see, for example, that, JavaScript is above Python. Like they're technically in the same domain. We don't make it super easy to filter out a domain level index, but you can still identify that, technology A is a programming language and it is ranked higher than technology B, which is also a programming language. In terms of scope, we track a lot more technologies, 932 currently, and we use a significant number of data sources. Oh, I should mention, this just reminded me, on my last slide, the IEEE Spectrum Index does use a significant number of data sources. The issue there is that their methodology, at least last time I looked, was somewhat simplistic, and my main complaint with how they do things is they make it so you can weight the different data sources kind of subjectively, which to me kind of negates the entire point of an index, which is to kind of provide a quantitative sense of popularity and engagement around a technology in the world. So, but if you can just kind of drag around a weight slider and make up your own index, then that makes it really hard to have meaningful discussions from one person to another about about reality, right? So because you might be like, oh well, I don't really like GitHub, so I give it a low weight and I give Stack Overflow a high weight, and then your buddy is like, no, I really like GitHub and I really like Stack Overflow, and instead I actually kind of dropped the weight on some other data source, and so then you're arguing about, you don't have like a shared frame of reference, right? So, and that is one of the things that was really important to me to do with the technology index, was to avoid that. So there was discussion, we did have discussion in the early days about, do we want to weight different data sources? By how much? Do we want to offer that as to users, so users can input different weights on different data sources and kind of get their own index? And I was dead set against that approach for that reason. If you don't have a shared context, then it's really hard to have meaningful discussions. You can disagree. Like someone could look at the index and be like, well, I don't think that's reflective of reality, and that's fine. But at least you're not talking about different numbers. You're just talking about, to what degree do you believe the different rankings on the index, right? And so the other reason we've been so transparent with methodology is that I want to be as credible as we can here. And I think credibility is supported by being transparent. So the more our audience knows about how it works and trusts that we are not hiding anything, and we feel confident in the choices we've made and willing to support them, and yeah, just, what's the word? I'm spacing out here. But yeah, but we're willing to basically go to the mat for the choices we've made, and I mean, there are always ways that we can do things better. A lot of the choices we made are basically weighing the cost benefit and choosing the most effective and efficient approach, even if there are better ways that are more kind of costly, right? So, but our methodology is one of the most expensive areas or pieces of like the technology index. So because we have handcrafted search queries for each data source for each technology, so that's a lot of handcrafted search queries and phrases. And our philosophy there is to determine the most simple and consistent search query that gives us the most relevant results, right? So if we can throw a modifier, for example, if we're talking about Google search and we have a very generic technology name like Flow, Facebook, but what we're really referring to is Facebook, like the open source project from Facebook called Facebook Flow, then if we can just throw a modifier of Facebook in front of Flow, and if we check the out to the 10th page of results from Google, and we see that, yeah, you know, like the 10th page is all or almost all Facebook Flow related, then we call that good enough, right? So we don't want to be overly specified and get too few results. So, and granted, there are some weaknesses in doing it manually, doing handcrafted search queries, but on the whole, we feel like it's a much better approach than applying kind of like the X programming approach. So our data sources are YouTube, Google Search, Stack Overflow, GitHub, Reddit, AdWords, Dice, and Indeed. We selected those, honestly, and basically somewhat subjectively, just looking for data sources that would help capture not as much, so kind of like a crowdsourcing approach where we wanted signal from different data sources that would help solve for the bias problem. So we've got Stack Overflow and GitHub, yes, that are biased towards software development, but Reddit, AdWords, Dice, Indeed, and YouTube and Google Search are not, right? So hopefully using the crowd kind of approach and taking the median of the signal from each of those data sources, you know, so far at least, it seems like it gives us pretty directional read on how popular a technology is, how much engagement is around that technology. All right, so how we built it, again, this is the 10,000 foot view. We basically 3 years ago to today, so I started out, my first language is R, so I started out in R, and most of the code is still in R. About 10,000 of the 12,000 lines of code is in R. There's 1,000 lines in Python and 1,000 lines in Julia. So Julia is the most recent. I wrote our Reddit data extraction and processing module in Julia. Just side note, I really like Julia. I think it has a bright future. And I look forward to using it more in the future myself. So the code is written on written, developed, maintained, and run off an AWS EC2 instance. It's a scheduled job, and it kicks off and runs every month. It is engineered basically to be rerunnable. So because, like, you know, I have 8 data sources, and, you know, on any given month, typically at least one of them breaks. So I had to fix like the parser or something like that. So it's engineered so I can get back in there, find out what broke, fix it, and rerun it, and, you know, recalculate everything. So I do use Scraping Hub Crawlera for rotating proxies to scrape the results from Google, which is, I recognize, an estimate of the amount of indexed content they have for that search. The front end is in Adobe Experience Manager, so I'm really grateful for the expertise and assistance of our marketing and digital teams to create that. And then I also use Tableau for visualizing and inspecting the data so I can kind of keep track of if there are any data issues and do so in a more graphically appealing manner. So how is it built? It's a combination basically of APIs, some scrapers, and some public BigQuery datasets. So the public BigQuery datasets are for GitHub and Stack Overflow. So those are awesome. I'm grateful for those. The APIs, let's see, are for YouTube, AdWords, forget, Scrapers is Google Search. Oh, yeah, YouTube and AdWords. Scrapers is Google Search, and Indeed and Dice. Oh, and another API, there's actually two of them for Reddit. Yeah, so, and then there's a bunch of index score and growth rate calculation code. As I already mentioned, Tableau dashboards for data inspection. And then the technology index is the result of a lot of collaboration with many other people in many other groups at Pluralsight. So particularly the marketing group and the comms group, the digital group, customer success, and then Pluralsight 1 generously lent us one of their visualization experts to create the bubble chart and maintain that. So very grateful for all of their contributions and continuing collaboration and help. So okay, so known issues and challenges. So as you can imagine, when it's hand-crafted search queries, it can be difficult to scale. You know, like if you add another data source, so we have 8, and if we want to go to 9, that means that right off the bat, I have to populate 932 search queries just to maintain parity with all the other search queries and the number of technologies and their search queries from other data sources. So, and then if I want to add even like a single technology to be tracked by the index, then I have to create 8 search queries, one for each data source, just for that technology, right? So it is approaching about an hour currently to add a technology. And the more data sources we add, the longer that will just go up. So, but we do need to add a lot of technologies in order to make sure that it is useful. If we're not tracking an adequate representation of the technology landscape, then it limits its usefulness. And also, in order to be credible, it needs to utilize as many data sources as possible, right? Like when there was a time when it was only like 4 data sources, and that was about 2 or so years ago, and it was less credible then because it's, you know, people who would look at it would be like, oh, well, it's only getting data from a few data sources, and now we have 8 data sources, which is, in my mind, a lot more credible. But even so, I would still like to add, what would I think of as credible? Probably 12 to 15 data sources. So I feel like there's still some weaknesses in how well we are accounting for IT ops and security professional. So we could add some data sources, like maybe some signal from Spiceworks forums for IT ops stuff. Yeah, so a lot of it has to do with identifying communities that reflect kind of like a certain audience. So like Spiceworks forums, I've been told, is widely used by IT professionals, which makes it a potentially good data source. We like to have social signal, we like to have employer signal, we like to have content signal, like in the form of like YouTube stats. We like to know what people are searching for and what people have created content around. So that's like the Google search and AdWords. But I would like to still have Twitter, Spiceworks forums, and anything else that y'all think would be useful. In terms of kind of minimizing bias and kind of using that crowd voting approach. So please do reach out with any suggestions. It can also be difficult to maintain relevance of search results, right? So you can imagine that we create a search query maybe a year ago, and then a vendor releases a new version or they rebrand the product. Like you'll see this from Microsoft on occasion and others, but I'm just thinking of Microsoft right now, where it's essentially the same product, but they rebrand it with kind of like when they get to some major new release and entirely change the name. And that means that in all the search queries, I need to adequately accommodate that, right? To make sure that the results I'm getting maintain relevance, right? Otherwise, it could look essentially like the technology is dying if people start searching for example, the new technology name, even though it's the same technology but the new name, right? And then it can also be tricky, as you'll note, I didn't look at this, I didn't show you this specifically, but meaningfully ranking essentially parent-child technologies is not something we do well right now. So for instance, we have Linux and Ubuntu ranked side by side, right? So Linux is above Ubuntu and CentOS and Red Hat. But Linux is essentially the parent of Ubuntu and those other flavors of Linux, right? So we are working on a better solution for this so that we can rank that better and display it better. But right now, that is definitely something that people do notice and have mentioned and that we know about. Segmenting by audience also doesn't make a lot of sense to a lot of the users of the technology index. So I hear this probably every month, like, hey, like, why aren't you tracking, big technology X? And I'm like, well, actually I am, but it's just under a different audience. So for instance, I received the question, why aren't we tracking Julia, the programming language? And I said, well, we are. And they said, well, I can't find it. It's not on the software development index. And I'm like, well, that's because we're tracking it under data. So, and another example would be Python. So I've had people ask, like, where is Python in data? Well, we map Python currently to the software developer audience because it's the majority of Python's application is still by just software developers, even though it does have rising application in the data audience. But again, it's not intuitive for a lot of users, and it is also not entirely accurate. So if all the popularity signal for Python maps to software developer, it's not accurate because some of that popularity is actually derived from its growth and popularity for data application, right? For machine learning, for data science, for analytics, that kind of thing. So that is another thing we're working on, but currently don't have a fix publicly exposed for that yet. And then also the last bullet point there, sometimes you do want just a specific domain index, right? You want to be able to look at front-end frameworks, relative popularity, one versus another. And there is some signal on that from resources like the Stack Overflow Developer Survey. But we hope to be able to do better for sure than we currently do, and even hopefully better than competing alternatives out there in the future. Ideally, I would like to see the index where you could slice the index into any number of domain-specific indexes. So you could really look at even, say, things like cross-platform frameworks, front-end frameworks, back-end frameworks, databases, NoSQL databases. So you could really look at any kind of specific domain and compare these peers within that domain to each other. So hopefully someday soon we will have a fix for that available, but currently we do not. So Q&A, if you reach out to me on my LinkedIn profile. So I am at LinkedIn. My profile name is Abe Burnett, and I'm happy to answer any questions, connect with any of you. And I did receive some requests on the live webinar to add some technologies. So I will be adding VB.NET and Visual Basic, Razor Pages, and WebAssembly. If anyone else out there watching this recorded webinar would like me to track any other technologies, please do reach out. Send me a message on LinkedIn and I will get that added. As I mentioned before, we do poll data once a month. And I do have quite the ongoing list of technologies to add, so it might take me a month or two to get it added and then start pulling data on it. But if you ask, I will prioritize your requests. So I thank you for your time, and please do reach out if you have any questions, comments, criticisms. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks again for watching.